and things like that. But I'm going to open up by reading to you. So you settle down for about 5 minutes. It's this YouTube video called Fear of Writing. Do any of you know it? It's basically the philosopher Jacques Derrida talking about I'm advancing into new territory, somewhere I haven't been before. And this type of advance often demands certain gestures that can be taken as aggressive with regard to other thinkers or colleagues. I'm not someone who is by nature polemical, but it's true that deconstructive gestures appear to destabilize or cause anxiety or even hurt others. So every time that I make this type of gesture, there are moments of fear. This doesn't happen at the moments when I'm writing. Actually, when I write, there is a feeling of necessity, of something that is stronger than myself, that demands that I must write as I write. I have never renounced anything I've written because I've been afraid of certain consequences. Nothing intimidates me when I write. I say what I think must be said. When I don't write, there is a very strange moment when I go to sleep. When I have a nap and I fall asleep, at that moment, in a sort of half sleep, all of a sudden I'm terrified by what I'm doing. And I tell myself, you're crazy to write this. So is such and such a person. You're crazy to contest such an authority, be it textual, institutional, or personal. And there is a kind of panic in my subconscious, as if, what can I compare it to? Imagine a child who does something horrible. Freud talks of childhood dreams where one dreams of being naked and terrified because everyone sees that they're naked. In any case, in this half-sleep, I have the impression that I've done something criminal, disgraceful, unavowable, and somebody is telling me, but you're mad to have done that. And the implied command in this is, stop everything, take it back, burn your papers. What you're doing is inadmissible. But once I wake up, it's over. What this means, or how I interpret this, is that when I'm awake, conscious, working in a certain way, I am more unconscious than in my half-sleep. When I'm in that half-sleep, there's a kind of vigilance that tells me the truth. First of all, it tells me that what I'm doing is very serious. But when I'm awake and working, this vigilance is actually asleep. It's not the stronger of the two. And so I do what must be done. So how much of that is relatable to you guys? For me, I think I watch it so much when I'm trying to write because it articulates something that I didn't know there were words for, like just this sense of... He's talking about his work as a philosopher, but I feel that in the work of fiction, there is that similar sort of tension and confusion where you're extending a tradition by deconstructing it. So you do have to attack, and you do have to be aggressive, but you're like, sorry, while you're like attacking the construct. So yeah, any thoughts from you guys?
Camilla, I mean, because I was thinking about both Camilla's work and Sarah's work that you've read this morning, and Camilla's comment about dialogue and how either you evade it or it just doesn't occur and it doesn't feel like a natural, or it would be a forced occurrence in your work. And you mentioned voice, Sarah, in yours, and how that is a driving or propulsive or has to be recurrent. Thank you. When you were saying that, I wondered whether this idea of this is inadmissible, who am I to say this is crazy, that an act of writing, and maybe particularly fiction, allows almost a performance of voice, which a direct engagement through philosophy, and I'm making a binary here that maybe I shouldn't, doesn't quite permit. You are enacting a viewpoint that is fashioned to be external to both the reader, the audience, and to you, the writer. So I suppose my thinking here is that there is artificiality in some way within or necessary for writing fiction, and that maybe that permits that anxiety around, is this admissible? Who am I to do this? Who's going to listen? I hope they don't listen. It allows that to become something more abstracted rather than I, the author, am telling you that this is true. Maybe that makes it a bit more of a complicated but also easier act to commit to. I don't know.
Yeah, I think everything he was kind of saying, that's been a quite recent crisis for me. I think for most of my life, I kind of went happily through it like a garbage truck, just consuming everything from everyone and then spitting it out in a story. And then I think like last year had someone like confront me about it, like through like they read my notebooks and were quite angry in this really like middle school way, and that just caused me a crisis where since then I've been like questioning everything I do and the kind of morality, I guess, of that, or like taking from life and transmuting it into fiction. So now I'm really trying to double down on my like garbage truck self and make sure that she's not confined or afraid, because I think that's really important to not censor yourself in that way. And I think the person was like trying to censor me or afraid I would write about things from their life or people they knew. But I think even when you do that and take those scraps, it becomes like something else. But then also I think like revenge novels are quite fun too. And I like when people just have like a shameless kind of sense of revenge and stuff, someone like Patricia Highsmith. And so I want to like embrace that more rather than Derrida's kind of guilt.
So far, it sounds like Eley and Camilla feel no fear. You're like, that's not relatable to me. I just write what I want, or is that?
Oh, I don't want to give that impression.
I know.
It's
so because it sounded like you understand the source of the fear, which is kind of in the constructs and how it turns into this hall of mirrors, and you're just kind of, and then you have to escape it. But also, you're kind of, by rationalizing it, do not feel it, or is that not it?
Maybe in some, thank you, sorry. Maybe in some way both, that if I'm able to say, it's not me saying that, it's the ventriloquist and my brilliance of ventriloquism through text, that I am both fearful but able to distract the reader from my fear and anxiety. I don't know. Kay, you...
No, and in that as well, I'm curious about the interaction between public and private, right? So I feel like there's a private self that first encounters the idea or starts developing the idea, and then you have to kind of, at least it's how it felt for me, and then you start thinking about the public self within that as well. And that's such a complicated part of the writing process, especially when you move from first novel to second novel to third novel. And I think in that text or in that piece that you read out, it's... there's something happening with that as well, that movement. And I think about public and private all the time, and I don't know if other people do. Yeah. But obviously, it's so much of, I think, like, if you have to answer to identity in your work, which I do a lot, then that interaction becomes the line between them becomes even finer, where it's like you're being asked to represent the self within the book as well. So it's, yeah.
Is there a sense of apprehension, not so much exposure, other people will see what I conceal, but I will see what I conceal whilst writing.
That I will see what I conceal. I'm having
being confronted suddenly by.
I'm actually in trouble for that very specific thing at the moment, where it's like I'm avoiding on the second novel. The edit's been a disaster because I'm avoiding that. Like I'm avoiding this like central thing that I don't want to have to reveal, because then I feel like I have to answer to it, and that's quite complicated to then be kind of on a stage like this and be asked questions that require you to maybe move beyond a point that you were initially comfortable with. Like it's quite, there's quite a lot of, a lot of forgiveness in the process, I guess, where it's like you have to forgive yourself the beginning and the end. Like this self like keeps like multiplying through the text, and then you have to answer to all of them at the very end of the book, if that makes sense. But.
Do you have to answer though? Like, do you feel like you owe?
I'm learning how not to answer. I think I felt like for a long time I had to answer, and now I'm learning that I don't always have to answer, I suppose, is the ongoing answer to that question. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess choosing the timing of the answer as well. Sarah and Eliza, any?
I feel like when I wrote my first novel, I didn't really feel much of a sense of fear because it wasn't necessarily going anywhere. and it wasn't necessarily for anybody else but me. And then I found that when I was writing my second novel, and I had this quite cursed experience of my first novel went viral on TikTok while I was in the middle of writing my second novel, and I would not recommend that to anyone. So it suddenly went from this thing that I was doing purely for pleasure that felt very joyful and very something that was not a fear-based experience. And a lot of things in my life are fear-based experiences. That the second novel then became quite dominated by anxiety for me. I think it became immediately like a commercial anxiety as well as a kind of personal anxiety with true crime and what that is and why we do it. And I know that a lot of people really like it, so I was sort of anticipating, like, they're gonna eat me alive. The true crime girlies are gonna find me and kill me in my house. Yeah, exactly. And then they'll make a podcast about it. Well, you worry podcasters, we're gonna.
No, I had a different set of worries. I think like one of my primary drivers in writing as in life is shame, and I tend to like deny that I am a writer at many available opportunities. But so it is like, it doesn't inhibit me, I guess is what I'm saying. Like I feel it and I am really afraid, but I sort of enjoy, like I take a savage pleasure in my own fear and shame, and in using a narrator as a kind of deferral of that, like making it the most abject that it can be, like taking those feelings and transforming them so that you really are, you're almost like objectifying them in a person.
First, what about being a writer makes you want to deny it, or is it more sort of the I part, like that's not my persona, like writers are fine, but I'm not one of them?
It's a good question for my psychology.
All right.
I think I just find it embarrassing to
it is a
admit
bit.
it.
I find it a bit embarrassing, but also I don't think it's the most embarrassing thing to be.
It's not.
I kind of find it embarrassing. I actually find saying I'm an author embarrassing, whereas I say I'm a freelance writer, and I find that less humiliating because that could mean anything. That could mean I do copy or something. And I think that's more ambiguous, and I think I like that a bit more because I also feel like sometimes, I don't know if this is more of a, I don't know, I feel like if you say I'm a writer, I think a lot of people will hear that and think, okay, so what's your real job then? And that's your hobby that you're sort of quite confidently declared as your profession to me. And I'm like anticipating that basically, so I'm just kind of like, oh, it's freelance.
There's something about like, it feels like a great act of hubris to say I am an author, even if it's a fact, even if you have written books. And so, I mean, I obviously have that hubris because I do write books, but I just don't like to own up to it, maybe.
But no, it's true that, and also it's a strangely like transitory state. One of my favorite Calm's little playlets is a guy appearing on stage and saying, I'm a writer, and then somebody appears and says, I think your books are shit, and then he drops dead. And I think that's exactly it. Like, you're just kind of like, I'm a writer, and someone's like, are you though? And you're like, I don't know, you didn't like my book? Yeah, that's how it that's how
or
it
even
goes.
like, Edmond Jabet talks about like the book of torment between, once you finished a book and you haven't started on a new project, or you're about to start on a new project.
Yes.
But it's that period where you're just nothing, right? Because if you're not writing, you're not an author. If you're not writing in the moment, right? It's not guaranteed.
So I mean, it's great that we get to resurrect every time we start a new project.
Yeah, I've been on residency in Ireland, and I was just going on like apps to try and make friends and whatnot. And I noticed so many people like had writer as their profession, and I was like, nah, I've never heard of you. Like, what do you actually do? But then someone pointed out to me, they were like, well, Ireland has the best like arts funding in the world for writers, so actually they are all full-time writers. But unfortunately, Ireland isn't the world. So I think, I definitely think like transparency is important. Like I was able to write full-time the past year, by which I mean also like doing tutoring and reviewing and stuff, because I had like a Creative Scotland grant. But before that, like I was working in a wine shop. And so my kind of like default thing will usually to say what my day job is first. Like I'll be like, oh, I'm a bartender, or I'm working in an off license, and then kind of later the writer bit will come out. But I think I feel like, yeah, it feels like I get insecure to say, because it is such a financially precarious thing to do, and like the average writer in the UK only makes about like 6 or 7 grand from their writing per year. So it's like a hard thing to say too, because yeah, like most of us actually don't make a living from writing, so it feels like simplifying just to say, oh, I'm a writer.
Yeah, it flattens out the complexities for sure. Yeah, I feel that too. Because it feels like in order to say it, you have to be doing it full time or something. Yeah.
But I do it full time, and I still find it embarrassing. I don't know if it's maybe the being able to staple the word freelance in front of it makes it sound less, because I suppose that does make it more representative of like I'm doing a number of things rather than I put out one book every 3 years and just live off it in my big Scrooge McDuck swimming pool full of coins.
This kind of leads into my next question, which is, I guess chronologically speaking, was there a point when you began to feel as if you're living the life story of someone who might be a writer, or someone who has an unhealthy relationship with words, which is what I think being a writer is, or just somebody, where you're like, okay, wait, something has begun, writerly wise?
I mean, it's a really important question, and maybe coming back to fear and humiliation, that often it's this notion of not only, if I've published a novel but have not yet written or had an idea for the draft of whatever next project it is, no one is asking like, so you're in a state of intermediacy. No one asks that at a dinner party, or at least I don't even have apps for friendship. I don't go to dinner parties, but I don't think people ask that. And so the more one experiences maybe parts of the publishing industry that are either surprising or draining or in a flux or precarity itself that you maybe didn't appreciate. So I think this idea of what felt like a very long-standing childlike, and also from my childhood idea of like, I want to be a writer, realizing that isn't a career, that isn't a lifestyle. If it is, that's because it is embedded in a culture of leisure rather than one of industry and labour. That it, in a way, I think if I, at the outset of a project, thought about it in terms of longevity or in terms of how is this going to make the next 5 years possible, I actually wouldn't be able to write the work that would let me sleep peacefully in a kind of Derridean way. I think then it would become something artificial and resented for its artificiality rather than something celebrated, because it was a place where I could choreograph spuriously, where I could think about psychology in an interesting to me way rather than something that required attention in a functional capacity. But I don't know if that answers your question actually, and
It kind of sounds like you're deconstructing any narrative for yourself, like you're deconstructing any narrative in which you begin to be a writer, right? Like, so you're like, I haven't begun, which also makes sense, because then you have the beginning to look forward to whenever that is. But I'm sure there must have been a moment when you're like, I think I might be like this. I think I might be a bit.
I mean, maybe this links to what you were saying yesterday about if you look back at your collected works, you're saying, well, this is the gingerbread book, and then this is the Prague book, and there might be a different Prague book that almost answers the previous one. That not only is it a case of you're only as good as your last book, but also that you are creating the raw materials for what happens next in the moment of creative labour that you're currently faced with. So, I mean, I don't know, if none of my books sold again, I didn't get another book deal, I know that I would be writing and probably would enjoy writing more, and I suspect would be a better writer. If my editor's here, I don't listen necessarily to that. But I do think that then maybe actually I'm answering the question of why am I evading that label of writing? Like that maybe actually then I would celebrate my attraction to writing more than now. It feels maybe like an arrogance or a display of privilege rather than actually what I hope the engagement that a reader would have with the text is one to do with more kind of fundamental or important questions or answers or illustrations or entertainment.
So you feel that you can write the things you write without being a writer? Do you have a sense of like an authorless, like that you're not involved in some way? Or that you're only involved through the creation of a persona that writes? This is getting very involved, and I still want to hear from the others. But
yeah, I just want to talk about my mum, and that I think I conflate more and more without realizing it publication and published writing than I do the act of writing, and yeah, no, it is, and draining and weird, and that's something that was not part of my thinking at all until I was published. And that makes sense on one level, but it is not creative thinking or positioning or awareness. And I definitely don't mean to position it as a positive thing. But does any of this feel familiar, or does it feel like I'm kind of...
I'll modify the question to pre-publication. Did any of you get a sense of the beginning of a story? I'm thinking specifically, when I was coming up with this question, of Mary Riffler in her brilliant book Madness, Rack and Honey. She writes about sending some short stories to a magazine, and she got a reply that said, "Oh, I'm sorry, we don't publish poetry." And that was her moment when she was like, "Oh, I think I'm a poet."
I think it's interesting to think of pleasure in this, I guess, that's a word that's come up a couple of times. And I think I had a similar experience. I haven't been writing for very long, which I think is quite a curious thing. So I think the word writer is still a really complicated word for me. And maybe that's what we're talking about, is what does that word mean? When does that word mean, I guess? When does it start meaning something, right? Is that what we're talking about, maybe? I think, so for me that's based in pleasure, which is, I don't know if that's the experience for all writers, but for me pleasure is such a huge principle in my work. It's both what I write about and what I write through. And when I'm in that place, I feel like a writer. When the pleasure is heightened, or when it feels like I'm... And I don't mean that in necessarily an only positive way. I suppose pleasure has this connotation of being kind of a sensual positive thing, but it can also work in the negative too. And that's when I feel most like a writer. And I think the humiliation around that word is to do with success, and that's where that word starts breaking down, which is what we're saying as well. As if you say I'm a writer, that word is met with an expectation, or that term now exists with an expectation. And if you cannot have that word met publicly, I guess it's about public and private for me again, and it can just be a private thing. I always feel like a writer, because it's where I feel most... I guess that's kind of what was being said before as well, was the movement between the unconscious and the conscious mind when it comes to writing, and when the thinking happens. Because in the act, that's when you're writing, and you are a writer, and then afterwards you start to second-guess the writerness of yourself, I guess. And that, I suppose, is also attached to publication. I don't know if that makes sense for anybody else.
Hear, hear.
Yeah, I don't know. In some ways, I feel like maybe I have maybe a slightly less complicated relationship with it. I think, which I don't know if that. Oh, I don't know. It basically, since I was a small child, I always wanted to be a writer, and whenever we used to do writing stuff at school, I would just do pages and pages and pages and pages and pages, and then I would get sent home with an exercise book to do my own writing with. which I never used to do because it's actually really difficult to sustain a consistent writing practice when you're 6. And I actually used to feel quite like bad about not being able to sustain that creative writing practice when I was 6. But then when I was about sort of 13 or 14, I started writing fan fiction. And I wrote, I actually totted it up between the ages of 14 and 21. I wrote 250,000 words of fan fiction, which is which is War and Peace for and it was just through like various stuff. So I feel like I've kind of, but if someone was to ask me when I was doing that, like I would be quite happy in like the fandom spaces I was in to identify as a writer, because I was like. I was popular, and but like because that was what I did, and that was a very clear role. But if someone were to ask me, like essentially in my real life, like, are you a writer, or like, what would you describe yourself as? I would never say that I was a writer. I'd be far too embarrassed, and I think it's because I also felt like what I was doing wasn't real writing. And then it wasn't until I was in my early 20s that I sort of started working on, well, when I was like sort of 20, 21, that I started working on like original stuff. And then that transition I think felt quite smooth for me, and a lot of sort of early craft stuff that seems to trip people up had become less of a problem because I'd already written War and Peace. I'm not saying it was as good, but maybe it was.
I'm saying it was better.
I would say it's much Nobel Prize. But yeah, so I had actually a really uncomplicated and fun and like quite, well, I had a really uncomplicated and fun relationship with writing. And then again, it was sort of publishing that started to actually muddy that and make it more of an anxiety filled and like, not like joyless, actually, maybe joyless is the word I'm looking for. Or at least it kind of saps some of the play out of it. It stopped being like a fun thing and became like a work thing. Yeah.
This is very relatable to me. I think after my first novel was fun, and then I didn't have fun again until my 4th. So good luck, like, enjoy.
I definitely relate to what you're saying about like the internet and that kind of being part of our writerly experience. And I was the same way as a kid. I always wanted to be a writer, and like I had this like gray electric typewriter I would like type up things on while like wearing a little beret or whatever. And then I submitted something probably when I was in my early 20s, submitted like one story to some obscure Canadian magazine. It was rejected. And I was like, okay, well then I guess publishing isn't for me. So then I'll just make like a Tumblr. And then so I just wrote things on my Tumblr. And that was probably freeing because I probably wrote the magazine story to be like a magazine story. Whereas like on my Tumblr, then I kind of went back to my like childhood voice and what I was doing then. And then I got, which is quite unusual, I got a book deal off of my Tumblr blog. And that was my start was kind of like through a less conventional path instead of sending out 20 stories and then getting published. So if I didn't have that, like one person kind of read my Tumblr and let me into that world, I probably wouldn't have like barged into that world myself.
I like the thought of the beginning of being a writer being pleasurable and like being connected to pleasure rather than connected to being good at or being seen as good at writing. The word for it, real beginning.
I think I even like really early on when I was first writing short stories, I even used to really enjoy the almost like slot machine experience of submitting short stories to places. I think because when you're just continually getting rejections, it's like, but then it becomes kind of like, oh, I got an elevated rejection, or like, oh, I got like a paragraph from the editor feeding back on the story. I used to find it quite like, woohoo, and then so I don't know, it's almost like, and then when if you do get something published in that kind of context, it feels like such a huge win. It's like so fun that like 6 people are going to read the story that got into like Prickly Pear magazine or whatever it is.
Also the most satisfying thing if you got like rejections, and then you can have that like moment like in Pretty Woman where she goes back into the clothing and she's like, big mistake.
Huge. Okay, my next question is about, I guess, you as readers or as consumers of culture. Can you remember any beginnings, like whether these are lines or sentences that just immediately hooked you and you're like, this is the beginning for me, or even scenarios or scenes? If you can't think of those, are there any sort of tropes that you just can't get enough of and you would just happily see replicated all over the place?
When you asked that question, the first one that came to mind is, I don't know how many of you have read Human Croquet by Kate Atkinson, but there's this isn't a spoiler in any way, I would very much recommend it as a novel. But at one stage, a character opens up a door and they discover on their doorstep a baby. And the surprise of this isn't central to the novel in any way. Excuse me. But the surprise is deeply felt by the central character. And the way that this is really subtly impressed upon the reader is that it's in normal type. You turn the page, and in huge type, there's a baby! ! And I did remember thinking when reading that, like, can you do that with publishing? Like, you're making it so obvious that our attention is meant to be on this pivotal moment. And then being blown away with the fact, well, this is playing with visual culture. This is playing with one's expectations for the novel without drawing attention or requiring an awareness of concrete poetry or the avant-garde. Like it was an accessible, cocking a snook at what you are as a reader and what the character is as an artificial construct. And I found that both very appealing, and yet I still do not feel bold enough to enact something similar. I don't know how I would do that, knowing that that's the kind of Hamlet's ghost for me, that it's a challenge to not rely on an assumed like smartness or tricksiness or mischief even that's going on from the author, but rather just this really appealing simplicity. So I guess, thinking about pivotal early moments of the medium of writing as well as much as the craft, that felt important. And it's been interesting hearing how much different visual cultures, whether in art history or cinema, inform now what it means to represent the world back in terms of what description, atmosphere, tone, and that the reading process requires a slowing down, right, of time to remodel the world in a non-haptic, tactile way, but through words, and how those textures, even kind of ineffable textures, you can somehow have a reader respond to that or hope to. Imagining kind of an album like that of non-material things is very appealing.
I think like when I was in my early 20s, I was really obsessed with minimalism. Like I was a Raymond Carver bore for a couple of years, and I was writing these like just horrible short stories, just like really, really awful minimalist Carver imitations. And then two things happened. I read The Loser by Thomas Bernhard, and I was just like, a few things happened. Like one was that I looked at just the construction of a sentence, these long, sinuous sentences. I'm obviously reading them in English translation, and the way that the narrative is shaped in these circle, like a spiral, and just what you could do with the musicality of the sentence, and it changed my attitude to writing completely, or actually it brought me back to a place that I had been before I was corrupted by minimalism, where I had been operating primarily again by sound. Like when I was young, when I was a teenager, that's how I would write, and my teachers would be like, "This isn't a short story; it's like a poem, a prose poem." And now finally I found like an outlet for, you can write novels like this actually. And then the second thing was I read Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin around the same time, and I was like, this is, like this novel is like a container for this placeless longing that when you're in you know, your 20s, it's like the thing that drives you or just takes over your life. And I was like, I'm going to take that feeling and put it in those sentences. And that's pretty much what I've been trying to do since then, I think.
No pressure. You already wrote War and Peace, so you don't have to
I feel like kind of not entirely dissimilar to Eley. I like really distinctly remember reading the 6th series of Unfortunate Event books, which I think just purely because of my age, I feel like I was sort of at the kind of start of there being quite a defined YA genre. Yeah, and I remember there's a page in I think it's in the Ersatz Elevator, which is the 6th one, where Daniel Handler / Lemony Snicket is describing this elevator shaft that is so dark. And then he's like, it's so dark, it's really, 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 really. And the entire page is just really, 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 really. And then he's like, in fact, it's so dark. And then just a colon, and you turn the page, and it was just black. They printed like a black square onto the page. And I remember it was like the first time I kind of encountered anything like, like I guess kind of experimental with the form and something like playful and fun. And those novels are so kind of gymnastic with their language, and they're like a vocabulary lesson in and of themselves. Like I feel like I would come away from those learning like 20 new words every time. And I feel like that was my first kind of wow experience with books.
I was thinking about the teenage girls that asked you last night. They're starting, whoever was here, maybe everyone was here, and I don't know, but probably and then maybe they are here actually, the book club. Okay. And they asked that wonderful question that I've been thinking about ever since. And it's good because it's been prepping me for this question, I think, where it's like they wanted a book that wasn't too easy but also wasn't too hard. And I think that's such a perfect definition of trying to enter culture at that age, or trying to find a way to consume culture, because it feels like you're looking for a kind of permission. Like you're looking for a permission, a way of writing, a way into writing. And I think like even now, that's like my favorite way to be as a reader, is to try and find permission to write the way I want to write, which maybe is a strange way of looking at it, because it's maybe supposed to feel more up to me somehow. But because of how I am as a person, permission always has to come first. I'm a goody two-shoes initially. So. But for me, it was Autobiography of Red. That was one that I thought of by Anne Carson that would be amazing to read at 14 or 15. That blew my mind about what a text could be and how it could be. And what you were allowed to. I mean, she just does whatever she wants. Anne Carson. There's there's no rules. There's no limit to language. She is forever playful, but also so meaningful. And I think a text that gets to be both playful and meaningful is like the kind of text that I love. Also, The Secret History was one that I kept thinking of last night for the book club. That was one that really blew my mind, that you could that a book could make you feel smart. I think that was the first time that I read a book and I was like, I'm smart. You know?
Yeah, I felt really bereft that I hadn't read that when I was like 18 or 19. I think it would have ruined my life, and it would have become my entire personality. And I would have been like, I'm like a dark academia.
I didn't read it till my mid or late 20s, and I was so bereft that I hadn't read it in high school, because one of the characters is called Camilla.
Yeah,
and so I would have just become her. I had taken classics in my first year of uni and dropped out of it. I'm like, if I read this book, I would have entirely tried to become her. So maybe it's good that I didn't, because I would have ended up killing someone.
10,000 words about the narrator and Henry kissing or something. That probably would have been my entire...
I'd be like, where's my Henry? I think during the break, I was talking to a few people about kind of formative books. And one for me was... I think it actually is a Canadian book called The Stinky Cheese Man and Other Tales by Brian Selznick. And that blew my mind, because this was, of course, I didn't discover Angela Carter and what she did with fairy tales for another 20 years or whatever. But this one, it's like, oh, you could rewrite classic fairy tales to be gross and smelly. That's amazing. So then I wrote a version of The Frog Prince, where the princess had a rotting turnip instead of a golden ball. And so that kind of kickstarted me as a writer. And then just Roald Dahl as well. I always think the first book of literary fiction I read was Ezo Trot by him, which is about an older couple who kind of have this romance based around a tortoise. And that was my first kind of book about adults that I read and book that involved like romance in some way, and that was like highly formative. And like I love like very short novels. Like it's one of my like favorite forms to read, and I think it's because of his like kind of novels for children, but they did feel quite and also experimental, and the wordplay in them was so exciting.
Okay, the next question. I'm going to skip over a couple of things that we ended up talking about accidentally anyway. Oh, okay. So I guess this is about the conversion of experience into fiction. So have any of you guys read Rose Macaulay? She's just phenomenal. I think that Camilla especially would love her. Like it's elephants in the desert and just very like flamboyant, but also casual at the same time. Anyway, in her 1920 novel Potterism, Rose Macaulay briefly allowed one of her characters to drag the novel form to hell. She describes the novel as slices of life served up cold in 300 pages. Oh, it's very nice. It makes nice reading for people. But what's the use? Except, of course, to kill time for those who prefer it dead. Thoughts? Is there some sense in which producing a novel is the afterlife of experiences that you've had or experiences that you want to transform, or are you more on the imaginative side of things where it's kind of like I didn't need to experience this to write about it?
I think it's like sometimes it can be like the classic catharsis, and I feel that more so with, well, I've only written one novel, but feels like I'm trying to expulge something, where like a short story feels more like a diary, and it's just like my fun obsessions and stuff of the time, where there's more of a sense of expulsion with a novel and like getting something out of my system. And so like I wrote a novel about the time I was working in a cinema, and like since then I like barely go to the cinema, but I also like felt like an obligation to like capture that point of my life, so it was like less imaginative than my other writing. Like I transmuted some things in it into like the surreal or whatever, but there was this sense of like, I need to like capture this experience, because I think it's a very specific experience to be like a cinema usher, and I want to like read about that, and it's like hard to find writing about that. So I kind of had this like task, which I never really had before with my writing.
Yeah, I guess that's I think that's a question that I'm definitely still working out, and maybe kind of relates to what I was talking about earlier, where I'm not always sure how much of my own experience to give away in a text. And I think that with my first novel, which was written from this place of quite like pure pleasure and had like a very straightforward intention with it, which was just to write like a horny lesbian novel. And it didn't really get any more complicated than that. And so I was able just to write through my experience in a way that was, it still seemed like it was just for me. And like now, it's funny to have a first novel and then have meaning made of that novel outside of your experience, because then you start thinking about your own experience more. It's like this strange cycle. And so coming into the second novel, I can feel myself trying to make meaning in a way that I wasn't necessarily before of my own experience. And I'm still not sure what side of that to land on, if it's making a terrible text. I think it's making a terrible text. So it's possible that I'm going to have to revisit it after this. But it's on my mind a lot at the moment. And again, like it goes back to how much self I want in the text, how much self I want on display, how much self I want to have to answer to. And part of that has to do with being a queer writer, someone who identifies as trans, where like that idea of experience and self is going to be used in a way that maybe is out of my control, that I'm not used to, this idea of perception of me within the text and outside the text, which is complicated. So yeah, it's a complicated relationship for me, I think. Definitely still figuring it out. It's funny with form, like in the short story, I get weirder, I think, and I feel that feels like more imaginative work. And in the poem, I'm like the weirdest, that's my weirdest space. And I think that's like, that's where the multitude of selves are, I guess. Yeah, it's interesting to think about.
I think my initial reaction is that actually with all five of you, what makes me so excited, because I remember reading for the granted books and just sitting up so much, but for like different points of what each of you were doing. and almost having my mind blown that you're all writing exactly at the same time, at the same point in time, because you're doing the thing so differently. And that thing is, as I said with the whole title of this seminar, just a complete roller coaster of subjectivity. I didn't know that there were this many different ways to take that roller coaster. And I think that self pervades through all of your prose. But, yeah.
I'm conscious of hogging this one. But yeah, I kind of, yeah, I think my first novel, I think I was just really angry when I wrote it. And I was 24 when I wrote my first novel. I was 24 and fuming, because I was like tail end of the Blair era. I was the first year of in the UK, we tripled the university fees, and I was the first cohort to have the tripled university fees. So I actually didn't have the option to rethink and think, fuck, maybe I should go and do a hair and makeup course at the college, instead of spending 45 grand or whatever to do with it. Not that I did spend it, I'm still in debt. And it's not that bad. I can't really complain compared to the Americans, but it still kind of sucks. And I finished uni, and I did an art degree, so I probably shouldn't have been surprised by this, but obviously I couldn't get like a degree job. So I moved back up to Newcastle. I'd done my degree in London, moved back up to Newcastle, and then immediately just started working in a bar. And then I worked at an Apple store, and then it was just meant that it was like every day was just some kind of like tiny, like someone shouting at me or somebody sexually harassing me, or actually that was it. Those were the two things. And yeah, I was just fuming. And I think that I feel like that was all kind of channeled into boy parts when I kind of started doing. I sort of gave up on art. I was always quite a shit visual artist because I was only interested in narrative. So everything I did ended up sort of circling back around to writing and stories in some way, shape, or form. So I felt like there was a kind of a lot of self in my first novel, but my first novel, for people who aren't familiar, is about a woman who does bad sex things to men all the time, and is horrible. And I was really conscious that people were going to sort of accuse me of being the same as my narrator, particularly because there are quite a few like clear autobiographical parallels, and that it's also ostensibly about a failed artist. So with my second book, I was really conscious of that, and I deliberately like tried to construct as much as possible a narrator that nobody could possibly compare to me. So the narrator for my second novel is a sort of middle-aged, privately educated, London-based journalist who is like trying to get his career back on track by writing about this horrible murder that happens in the north. And yeah, I don't know. There was one journalist at the Times that did still think that it was about, because it's set during Brexit, that thought it was my opinions on Brexit presented over the course of 400 pages, which maybe it is. You can decide. But yeah, I felt like I'd gone from having this first novel where it was really led by the self. And sort of about kind of unpicking parts of my own experience, my own anger, and exploring different parts of myself and essentially kind of my character flaws through different characters, to this second novel where I was suddenly really conscious of it and had like done all of this stuff to try and like separate the novel from me and almost kind of challenge readers to try and find me in it, if that makes sense. Yeah. A really long answer, sorry.
There was a recent commission that I had for an anthology called Duets, and the kind of rationale for the editor behind the commissions would be that there'd be individual short stories, but it'd be two writers that would be paired together to write that one single short story. And thinking about your question and thinking about, Eliza, you saying about, well, the separation of the self, but also saying, well, obviously these are my concerns, but I'm having to create this construct, and I'm actively going to do that. And the person I was paired with was my wife, Nell Stevens, who is a writer as well, luckily for her. And it was interesting to think about the fact that a reader not only might approach this text starting with formal structural concerns of, oh, who wrote which bit? Is that detectable? And why do I feel I can detect that? But also, is this not only this character or the situation that's in this fictional story indicative of the person, the author, but is it indicative of their relationship in that way? And the fact that it ended up being a ghost story, please don't read too much into that. But it was a case of then reading the anthology as a whole, seeing how the concerns that we had as authors, how the other authors had dealt with that, and that some of them had, excuse me, Nell suddenly emerges out of my throat and tells it all, body horror, but that some of them had quite clearly in one font or typeface, one narrator's story, and then it was clearly separated out. Another one, it would just be in dialogue, so you had this sense of, like, in a performance or an action of two people meeting. And it made me wonder whether, when you said, finding these writers and thinking about subjectivity, it would be very interesting if Granta had commissioned us all to write the same story and seeing how different that would have been, rather than, as is often the case, those of you that work in publishing or submit to publications, sometimes there's a theme or topic that they want people to respond to. Maybe, very occasionally, I don't actually think I've seen one, there might be a style prompt or a constraint in that sense. But the idea of there being a set of characters, a situation, beginning, middle, end, go and write this, it'd be very interesting to have that, as you used the phrase before, hall of mirrors, where all that is different is that subjectivity, rather than the scaffolding and reality of the building that they're surrounding. I don't know.
As someone who doesn't read for plot at all, like the way that I don't care about plot, I can't even tell you. It's all about style. Like the way that you tell the thing is the thing that makes me say that's my writer or that's not my writer. So I would absolutely love to see an anthology like that. Maybe we should campaign for one.
I think, like, I agree with a lot of what people have been saying. Like Camilla, I sort of feel that, or I've realized that when I start a novel, I'm operating on a point of, like, working out a specific kind of resentment, and so that's, like, the note of it. And I was really irritated in my first novel when people were making these biographical comparisons and saying, like, oh, she's just drawing from life, as if that. I mean, even if that was true, that doesn't, diminish the fact of, like, its transformation into fiction. So that in itself, I think shouldn't be disqualifying, or I don't accept that as a criticism. But I was also irritated because I felt that, it's something that's often ascribed to women that they just take from life. And I was irritated. And then with the second novel, I was like, okay, nobody could possibly think this is about me or my family. But so many people think the brother is my brother because I have a brother. And now I'm like, I don't care. Because that is, like, you have to be, really outlandish to think that or just think really that I'm, think really weird things about me, that I like to bathe my brother and horse brush him. And, like, people we know would say this. So I think, maybe that actually says more. Anyways, but yeah, so I think now I've sort of been liberated from worrying about that, and I'm working on something now that I'm sort of playing with, I'm, like, planting things to give to people who want to read like that. Like, all right, you want to read it biographically? Here, take this. And that's, because that's for that kind of reader, and that's fine, they can have that. But I'm keeping the rest for myself now, and I'm learning how to conserve that particular energy of not worrying about that. He's not my brother, by the way.
So I guess the next question is more about where your attention tends to fall when you're writing. So picture a situation in which writing a novel as an individual has just, like, faded out of cultural practice. And actually maybe it's a bit like with Eley's duets, but we all write novels by committee now. That's just what we do. And on your first day, you get to choose what department you're going to work in, like beginnings, endings, drama generation, dialogue, villain creation, characterization in general. What are you choosing?
similes. I want the simile department because I love a simile. It's like nice, beautiful holographic image, but I also hate like a bad simile more than anything, like really like overcomplicated simile. Like I was reviewing a book that compared like a large plate of French fries to a scout hut, and I didn't know what a scout hut was. I had to Google it, and I, went down a wormhole. And I was like, this is the worst simile ever because it's taken me out of the book and put me on Google to try and figure out this like clumsy image. And so I would be a quite like strict manager of the simile department.
I can really see that, actually. I'd be scared to work for you, I think. Can I have 2 departments?
Yes, you can.
I want the first line and I want the last line of a book. See, it's a good one. I knew it was good. As I was sitting here thinking, I was like, this is a good one. I love the first line of a novel I could work on for the rest of my life, and the last line as well. I love just like a last line that just like turns off the light but doesn't like close the door, That's the vibe, the shape of things. So if I could have both those departments, I'd be thrilled.
Also,
But I might be fighting for it now. I think everyone wants to work with.
Also, you get 2 chances.
Yeah. True.
Gosh, I feel like now, because both of you have gone for quite like specific things, I'm gonna sound like a dickhead and go for something big. But I think characters. I think I'm really good at characters. I think I'm good at making people feel distinct and separate and real. And there's nothing I hate more in a book than when I pick it up and everybody talks the same and they all sort of are kind of the same person, just doing different stuff. I hate it. And it's like my favorite part of any novel is to sit down and work out how, I don't know, almost like a set of rules for each character and how they behave. And I think I would like to look after that.
Oh boy. I don't know. Maybe like the vibes department.
We need a vibes department.
Like atmosphere and uncertainty. I'll be the mystery department.
I think we've got a good novel coming together right
Yeah, I'll be the janitor, let's be honest.
No.
Sweeping that apostrophe out of it shouldn't be there. It's not it is. Come on.
Okay, now more about process, I guess. I'm wondering about how you identify a beginning for each of your projects and whether arriving at that beginning has been different every single time, or whether you now have a kind of established mindset that you enter into and you're just kind of like, okay, I can feel something coming on, like almost like a fit or a, yeah.
I feel like I definitely can't force it, like it will come or it won't, and like a kind of a short story will come quite quickly and I'll just write down like, fragments of it and then like kind of sew it together, and it'll usually be sparked by something, like I'll be in a museum or something that I'm reading. Like I feel like I just wouldn't be able to write if I wasn't able to read, and I find it bizarre if there's like writers who say, oh, I like just never read other books. I'm like, but where do you get like the words from? Like I feel like my head would just be empty. So that's like a kind of, and that spark when you feel a writer that like belongs to you in this like deep way, that mixed with like kind of life experiences or seeing something in a museum will usually are the ingredients needed to spark something, where I'm learning with novels that it takes a lot longer and you have to let it percolate a lot longer.
I think to answer this question, it's good to think about form again. With a poem, if it's a poem, often it's a line, so I'll have like one line, not necessarily the first line, but often like a middling line that needs a lot of work. But I know it's a poem because it feels like it doesn't belong at a top or a bottom. If it's a novel, it's a first line, but I am now learning that that's not enough, and you need the rest of the lines to make the book work. So I'm currently kind of grappling with that. Although it's funny how firm the form feels when that idea arrives. With a short story, often, again, it's kind of anecdotal. Something that's like my garbage truck vibe, I guess, where like I'll kind of plagiarize from other people's lives, or that's where short stories live for me, I guess, because you have to have a scenario that's quite clean. But yeah, I think it's often line-based or like image-based, like especially for the novel. There'll be like a first line, but that's kind of like attached to a larger image that could be a whole paragraph, I guess, if that makes sense.
I don't know. In some ways, I almost kind of feel like I haven't written enough novels to know yet, because I've only done the 2, and I'm sort of a chunk of the way into a 3rd one, and I feel like the process has been really different each time almost. Like for my first novel, it kind of started as a short story, but it was literally just like I had like the idea for like the first scene. So it just sort of came from, I had the idea for the first scene, and then I wrote the first scene, and then I wrote the rest of it. Which made it sound very simple, but my first novel did feel like a really simple process in some ways. And then with my second novel, which is a much more formally complex thing, I think I started with like writing a scene that ended up being like 40 or 50 pages into it. I think for people that haven't read my second novel or even have it's sort of a fake non-fiction book, and I knew that I wanted to have it as this sort of matrix of different stuff. So I think one of the things that I ended up writing first was like an interview with the victim's mother that turns into like a long story about how she met her ex-husband and how they ended up having their child, who would then be the victim of this crime. And that was the first thing that I wrote, which I suppose is almost like biographically where that character's life started. And maybe makes sense at the time. And then that was all over the place. I wrote like a bunch of different stuff for that, and it ended up being a really disorganized process. And then for like the 3rd novel that I've started, I feel like I sort of had the idea, and then I just sort of started, and then realized that I would need to do something, because it's like more of a speculative thing, that I would need to find a different way to begin it so it would make sense for an audience coming into it. So I feel like I'm almost doing like the middle 80%. I'll have to come back to the first 10% when I start, when I finish the rest of it. Yeah, so I don't know. It's been quite different every time, and I wonder if it is just going to end up being quite different every time for me.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I feel like it's been different each time for me, but I think I've figured out that it's just like I'm trying to sort of fool myself into actually writing. So like this time, I came up with a plot, which I never do, and so I tried to write the story from the plot, and it was a total disaster. And I was like, oh yeah, like I don't care about this at all. This is it's not why I write. It's not what I'm writing for. So what I realized is that my process is like digressive. So I start from like a point, a line, and then, you know, I sort of know where I need to end up at the end, or what I want to get across. And then everything else is like a digression, moving away from the point always in order to get to the point. And I think that now that I've realized that, I feel less apprehension, I guess, because I know that it can come, and maybe that's okay to have a really inefficient style of trying to approach a story, like by creeping up on it or like sneaking behind it or something. But yeah, so it has been really different, but I think it's just because I'm still, for such a long time, my approach to writing was just intuitive, right? I didn't think about form. Like I read a lot, so you imbibe those forms, but I teach literature, so I should have always known this. I teach creative writing too. God. And I say all this stuff, but I'd never done it myself before. So now I'm figuring out my own forms, but it's like working backwards to kind of crack it. I'm getting there.
I mean, it's that so much of, I don't know, my experience of teaching creative writing is saying kind of like, this is what others have done, and then kind of hoping that you can just kind of fall out of the window in the seminar room, and they'll be like, and what do you do? And similarly, I think that in my experience with short stories, I'll start with an image, and then usually thinking about, well, why am I reacting this way to that mundane image or a strangeness? Why is it strange to me? And then I'll usually do that. You mentioned efficiency, this very inefficient thing of researching every element of whatever that thing is. So the one that comes to mind is a short story about a rat that has been trained to sniff out landmines, and the idea of a rat being poised on top of a landmine, and that someone has spent time training that rat doing so much research into that, into the word rat, into the fact that a group of rats in the English language is called a mischief of rats. Like, why, what am I being digressive and am I procrastinating? Yes. But also, why am I making links between those things? What's the link between landmines and laughter and rodents and vermin and training? And then working out kind of 3 weeks later that you can include all of those words and those things and have a narrative there without having to overinflate this short story to show your research, to show your working, and that actually that would be disrespectful to a reader's time, because that was necessary for me as the writer, but it is not necessary for a story, and it's not interesting for a story. But often there's a certain amount of, I mean, it's well known, but like a certain amount of resentment that a short story might be, 400 words long, but it's the one that's taken 10 years of notes and combing through it and rewriting it to have the effect that you started with, or that drew you to that narrative requiring a place on the page. Yeah.
I love that short story, by the way, with that. And I also love the short story that broke my heart, with the hedgehog, that begins with a hedgehog that's trying to swim around the swimming pool.
Yeah, this psychopathy with small animals.
Yeah, I was thinking that for somebody who's so circus with words and creates fireworks with them, like you're so detailed about alluding to the inner lives of those without words, right? Like hedgehogs and rats that seek out landmines. Yeah, that was just my point. And also, I'm very excited about your novel creating method that's happening. It makes me feel like the novel is very much alive. Do we have time for? Okay. One more question, maybe two, but I'm trying to think which of the two is going to be more important for me to get answered right now. Okay, it's about the difference between your interior monologue, like your everyday, when you're going around just what you're thinking, and the voices that you choose to write in. Like, is this a case of you putting disguises on that interior monologue, or are you creating an entirely new persona that's happy to talk to strangers? Like, it's a little bit public-private, like Hay was saying. Like, how are you going into your writing? How is your inner voice going into your writing, I guess?
It's funny that in reviews of my work, whenever this notion of whimsicality comes up, I know that I am a whimsical person, and I know that that is something that I find every day. I'll be like, I feel so moved, and that's a good day. But I react so poorly to it that there must be this sense of repulsion at recognition, right? And saying like, are you saying I'm funny? Well, fuck you. Like, it doesn't. I then find that now writing in that in a narrative voice, or trying to work out, well, how much of this narrator is me, or me kind of performing something completely antithetical to who I am, is now given over to this sense of, well, am I now having to create a narrator who is constantly anxious about how they're represented or how they're coming across? Are they someone that is whimsical but have to provide caveats to show that can contain complexity, or is it all right just to be whimsical? And how much of that is gender-coded and that comes from me or from something external? And I always find that, reading short stories that are narrated, say, by a marble or something like that, I'm like, oh, that would just be so marvelous. And what I'm saying is, no, I want to be a marble. I don't want to read a story necessarily narrated by one.
Don't we all want to be a marble?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. But are you talking to the reader the way that you talk to someone who knows you very well, or the way that you talk to yourself? Like, how are you addressing your reader?
I think probably in quite a sad way. I try not to know myself that well, for that reason. That I think that
you're less inhibited.
Yeah, less inhibited, or that I'm not actually. I'm not kidding myself. Like if I in the healthiest way of putting it, it would be like, well, if I'm in the moment and I'm reacting with authenticity and spontaneity to what I'm being confronted with, that feels like a very dynamic and genuine response to the world. And in a less healthy way, seeing as like, well, I cannot have responsibility and sympathy and empathy and understanding for every possible version of this moment. Can I? You just become kind of poleaxed with the anxiety of attempting to do that. And when it is to do with acts of communication, such as writing fiction, I think I would become too caught up in what I was doing as a generating agent rather than what I was doing for a reader encountering the text or the creative act. I don't know.
I was talking to somebody yesterday, and there was some stuff that came up when I was recording my audiobook, and initially they asked me, like, if we got an actor to do it, who would you want? And I just kept picturing, like, an old Jewish man. So I think, I think in some ways, like, maybe I just am an old Jewish man, but it wasn't. Like, I don't think of the narrators as me. But it is interesting because I have worked with first-person narratives in my 2 novels. And so the thing that I'm working on now is also, sorry to report, a first-person narrative. And I am worried that I'm going to end up writing the same thing again. But what I keep forgetting in writing is that, like, I am totally changed every time I come back to writing a new project. I've read so much more. I've experienced different things, and all of that life goes into it. So the voice is different, even if I'm not sure that it is. Like, I've shown it to a couple of people who are like, this character is very different. And I'm not doing it deliberately, but it's just, the things I'm inhabiting in that moment are different, or my concerns are slightly to the side of what they were with the last novel, I guess. Yeah.
I feel like when I wrote my first novel, at least the first sort of early draft of it, which was like a 15,000 word short story, which isn't a short story or usable in any capacity, it felt like it was in my internal monologue voice, and then I went through and like fixed it to make it sort of, I guess, like consistent with the character that I was actually trying to write. Like, it was really self-deprecating and really like, I don't know, it's just a bit more like normal. And then it was like a process of going through and kind of tearing that apart and transforming it and changing it to make it sound like a different person. And I've kind of taken that approach with like pretty much every voice I've used since. I think my second novel is very voice heavy. There's a bunch of different voices that like super aren't mine in it, that all had to have quite like distinctive rules, and I had to be really careful to make sure that they were consistent. And it was a lot of like if I wanted to write something in the style of like a stranger's Tumblr post, it was like having to pull on my experience of reading hundreds of strangers' Tumblr posts to think about how they're, or like a fake newspaper article. I had to kind of go and read, like, my second book ends with a Guardian interview, and I sat and read like a bunch of Guardian interviews so I could sort of copy the style of Guardian interviews. So yeah, I find that it's like it is something that's quite like it's like really important and quite central to my work. I think is like trying to strip my own voice out of it and make sure that everything sounds really, really different and is sort of distinctive and like, I guess, like realistic. I'm quite happy to take hits on style and prettiness for things to sound authentic as well. Yeah, I think, I don't know, in some ways I probably think that my internal monologue's probably has better line level writing than the voicier stuff. But the novel that I'm working on at the minute has been in third person, and that's actually been quite a challenge for me. I ended up I was writing it in third person past, and I found that I just couldn't, for long form, I just couldn't deal with third person past. I felt like I had too much authority. I didn't know who the narrator was supposed to be. I was like, what? It's retrospective, but from what point? So I ended up going back and making it. I'm putting it into present tense at the minute because I can't handle third person past.
Yeah, I don't. It's funny. I was talking to somebody. This is like a tedious link, but I was talking to somebody who had been interviewing a neurologist or someone in that field, and I might have the term wrong, but she was saying that it's quite. I have an internal monologue, but it's there's no words in it, so it's all image based, and I didn't know that was weird. So I thought everyone only thought in images. So if I think about brushing my teeth, I see an image of me brushing my teeth, and I don't think. So I don't have. And I didn't know that was weird until a week ago. And I was told, and my friend was like, "That's really weird." Like, I've talked to this. I don't even know if it was a neurologist. Somebody who said that most people do have, it's like sentences that pass through your mind. I don't have that, and I don't know. And apparently, it's not completely rare, but it's relatively rare to only think in images.
So how did you end up working with words? Like, why?
Because my answer to the question was going to be all of Mrs. S was like. I've only written one novel, so I don't know anything at all. Let's be very clear about that. But I break down the images as it appears in my brain. This is making me sound pretentious and like I'm saying I'm special. I am not special by any means. I just mean that like
you are special, Kay.
Thanks. So for me, writing is a way of looking or a way of noticing. And I have to break, and with Mrs. S, which obviously the first and technically only novel I've written, I found myself doing like a second by second of the image, which is an exhausting way of writing, and I won't ever do it again because, time, it's impossible to trap time like that. But if you're looking at an image, of course, you're trying to kind of ekphrastically break it apart, then you become kind of attached to time in a really complicated way. So your writing becomes, if you're putting that into action or you're trying to activate an image, it becomes very second by second, which is a really tedious way to read, like as some reviews of Mrs. S did say. But it's exhaustive. It's exhaustive to try and process a work like that. And I think, there's other reasons. I'm also very interested in looking and gazes and how people perceive each other. And I think if you're trying to write through that, then you have to do a lot of writing through the body, which is very second by second, I guess. But as it turns out, I don't have an interior monologue, which is crazy. So when I'm writing, it's all from image, which is weird. Yeah, essentially, yeah. God, I'm like so jealous. I don't know
Same.
if you... Sometimes I feel like my internal monologue is so intrusive that I will have moments where I will be looking at myself in the mirror and thinking, shut the fuck up. For anything for a moment of silence, to not just have the constant like. But I have that,
but it's pictures. So the stressful thing, it's really annoying. The stressful thing is happening to me, but I'm seeing it, so I'm like picturing it. So I'm not just like reading it to myself. I'm like, I've pictured it, I've seen it. It's like I think I'm like, I'm seeing into the future sometimes. It's a horrible way of. It's actually technically probably horrible. Anyway, on that note.
And Jinx, because I was going to say, I also mainly think in images. Sometimes I have it like a movie. Yes. So it's like then I can hear dialogue, but I can't actually hear it. And I can't, I did terrible in philosophy at university. I almost failed the course because I can't think abstract word thoughts. Like if you say justice, I'll imagine the justice lady, you're probably picturing her right now, or empathy, I'll see two people having a hug, but I can't abstractly think, I can't think abstractly what empathy is. I have to visualize it in some way. And then with characters, it's weird because it's I think in images, which it can be bad too because yes, I can entertain myself by sitting on the couch for 6 hours, watching a movie that I've seen. Yeah. But it feels debilitating sometimes because that can be
Also, it's 3 hours later and someone's like, where are you?
Yeah, and I'm just on the couch, just bit of drool, being I'm in this movie I saw 20 years ago.
Sorry, it's somebody, there's a really stupid tweet, I think, where somebody's I watched the film Shrek so much as a child that I could watch it in my head, and that my parents used to come into my room at night and be like, you better not be watching Shrek in your head. Maybe the next time sort of finding kind of internal picturing quite intrusive, you should just watch Shrek. Mentally watch Shrek.
Yeah, because the mental, it's almost like mental Tourette's sometimes, which is, especially if you've looked at something really unpleasant, and then you have to like see it again when you think of it. It's like quite upsetting. But I have this thing too where it get like, yeah, my stories are like very visual based, and I try and translate that to the reader. But I find like, yeah, the word like character's voice really alienating, or I don't know what it is, but like with characters, it's almost like I'm like putting on their mask and then like walking into this space I've created. Like it isn't, I cannot picture them as clearly as I can picture the room and stuff. But like when I'm reading a novel by someone else, then I can picture like the character quite clearly. Like by reading Portrait of a Lady, like Isabel Archer, is like I know what she looks like, and I actually, my cover of it has a woman on it, and I like scribbled out her face because I'm like, that's not her, that's not how I see her. I have like my own version of her. Yeah.
Maybe that's the part that you're leaving for the reader to finish, like, and that's why you can't see it as detailed, because you're... we have a little bit of time for audience questions, but I got so absorbed that we like overran into the audience question time. Sorry, guys. So please ask anything that you want to ask.
Yeah, it's on. Before we start with you, I just wanted to say to our online viewers that you can also use the chat if you have a question, and we try our very best to bring it to the panel.
Thank you. I had a quick question about community. So Camilla and Eliza, you were talking about sort of being online around Tumblr or fan fiction spaces. And maybe it's different now, Camilla and Kay, for the image, but like I just wanted to know what community meant to your writing, or if it means anything, or if it's an important part, but in general, just what community is to you in your writing practice.
Not really. I think it's more communing with the dead is the most important part with me, and like having conversations with dead writers and relating to them in some way. And I definitely like I have like writer pals, and they're like really stimulating to talk with and talk about books. But there is that interrelation of like the dead writers we're talking about as well. So it's almost like a weirdly like spiritual community as well, but I definitely think as a writer too, you have to be a bit of an outsider, not over involved in community, and that's important to keep that, like keep separate in that way as well.
Yeah, I kind of get that in the context of like needing to observe things maybe all the time, but I don't know, with online stuff I actually really miss like having more of a sense of community. I think because once your work enters this kind of more of a public space, I find that like fandom communities are actually really kind and really nurturing in ways that Goodreads super fucking isn't. But like, so like my experience of like early experiences of posting my writing online for me were like overwhelmingly positive. People were always really kind and really nurturing, and like really went out of their way to encourage me and help me and to like read stuff, which is something that I always found really like wonderful. So in some ways the sort of change to publishing, I feel quite deprived of that in some ways, and being able to talk to readers and sort of speak to other writers in this almost quite anonymized and quite gentle way, versus, even though I know that fandom spaces can get really, really toxic, at least for me the writing has always been very positive and very nice. And it is quite funny that like as soon as you're publishing professionally, you go from somebody who is like, I guess, kindly almost like donating their work for you to read for free about this thing that you all like, that you can read more, versus like, it's open season, baby. And yeah, I don't know, I think I miss having more of a community. I feel like you kind of just have to find in some ways community with other writers, but I do miss like interacting with readers and people who've read work, because now readers are like a sort of almost like a scary thing that you have to maintain a degree of separation from. Unless they're at your own events and they've like paid to be there and they're like nice to you. Did anybody else have anything to say about community?
Thank you. Having published some 12 or 14 novels up to this day and 4 more in the drawers, I feel that each new novel is more difficult than the previous. I feel that maybe writing is the only craft that gets harder the more you practice it? That's one question. I want to know what you feel about that. And the other question is, what is the role your unconscious mind plays in the solitary act of writing?
Definitely I can't really answer this question because I'm only working on the second one. I guess I had the book of poetry as well. It definitely gets harder. But it's interesting to think about those. I'm trying to think about those reasons at the moment. And part of it is to do with what Sarah was saying, is that you change as a writer. Like, that's a huge thing, is that each time you come to write a novel, whatever you thought you knew, you no longer know, or that information has changed, or you've changed. And so when you approach the page, I guess you're brand new every time, which is kind of reassuring. Like, there's times when it feels horrifying, I guess, or stressful, but I have to remind myself that it's a reassuring and exciting way to live, to always be confronted with how you've changed, each time you come to the page, I suppose. Yeah.
I feel like for me, I actually have found the sort of similar thing, that each novel has gotten more and more difficult, and I think in part it's because I feel like I've taking on greater technical challenge with writing, that each book I kind of want to be bigger and different, and to have more characters and to have more stuff going on with in terms of complexity of plot and theme. And I found that I had an idea for what I thought was going to be my second novel, and then what I thought was going to be my third novel, which is for ages I've wanted to do a fictionalized retelling of the Donner Party disaster. And every time I think about doing it, I think I'm not ready yet. I don't have the technical skills to be able to handle a huge ensemble cast to write a big historical brick book. I need to be that's gonna have to be 5 or 6 books down the line. And I found that to be interesting, the sort of increasing awareness of technical skill or lack of technical skill, and how each novel becomes sort of building up a degree of technical skill. I don't know, it's almost like when you lift weights. When you first start lifting weights, it's you do I don't know, if you bench press 4 kilos, it actually, once you're able to do that, it doesn't feel that bad. But then the stronger you get and the heavier stuff it doesn't get easier, it just gets heavier, and you're just able to lift it, but it still hurts and it's really uncomfortable. It's just, but you can do it now, but it's still really bad.
Yay, writing.
Yeah. What was the second question?
It's the role your unconscious mind play in the solitary act of writing.
I think this is maybe related to what I was talking about before with regards to the digressions that I have to take to get to where I want to be from a narrative perspective. So I was trying to write a very simple plot point A to point B. It should have been 2 sentences, and then I had a 7,000 word digression on fish farms, which is gonna have to leave somehow. But I think it bubbles up in that way, and then you find out what it is you're really writing about, because the narrative is just one part, and for me it's not even the most important part. The important part is the feelings that are animating it and the ideas that are animating it, and how to get those across within the structure of the narrative. So I think that's how my unconscious works. And the process of writing is the process of figuring out what I'm actually thinking and what I'm thinking about. And I need to do that to be able to kind of mobilize it, I guess.
I mean, it's so interesting that those 2 questions that you asked, they have these links, right? If there are 4 novels in the drawer, as you said, that in a way is the fermenting unconscious, but made manifest in some way, and an energized unconscious. And it always, by no means is this profound, but it always strikes me as interesting that Freud, who was mentioned in an early question or comment, in his work would use works of literature in order to make it clear what he's trying to describe in terms of the unconscious, not just because there'd be recognition or a way of finding correspondences between various forms of story, but that it's I think of it as impossible to uncouple the notion of unconscious and trying to delineate, whilst also not look too directly at the idea of motivation or desire when it comes to inscribing the world in the conscious way that might be met by another person's consciousness that we can never fully understand or visualize in that way. I don't know if that answers the question, but maybe kind of circles it in a way.
One answer. There may be others.
Yeah, I think unconscious is a massive part for me. Not also like in the sense of like percolating or fermenting things until they're ready, but also in a sense of like if I'm working on like a novel and I'm kind of like, oh, I see I'm trying to do this and that, I kind of try and shut that door, because then I know that I'll be like Captain Obvious in it, and I would rather it kind of come out unconsciously, not be fully aware of it. And then it's fun if I read the book a few years later to then kind of see that. And I think with technical stuff, I've only written one novel as well, but then I have like complete amnesia of how I did that. And I've heard some people are like that with childbirth, where you go through it, it's horrendous, and then you get amnesia so that you'll want to have a second child, even like you forget how painful it was. Like I've just heard a lot of folks who've had that experience say that, and so I definitely relate to that. And then, yeah, it's like, you know, there's a writer like Virginia Woolf who didn't find her style of writing until she was 40. Like she wrote a few novels that were more kind of realist and conventional, and then that's when she like really took off. But then sometimes I've read kind of later novels by novelists I like, and I can see almost the decay from like, okay, they were really good at this point in their lives, and then there's been some sort of decay in the way that they've kind of, I guess, the arc of what they're doing, and I don't know if they'll pick up from that or if that's just natural. But that has made me really afraid of the idea of like decay and like, oh, there's going to be I have this fantasy that I'll write until I'm 99 or whenever, but I'm not sure if that's sure or if I can trust the capacity of my brain. So it's kind of made me really hyper conscious of keeping my brain healthy. We got to get fish oils and stuff. Yeah. So that's
where the fish farm comes in.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah, over here. Sorry. I guess I will give a quick context before I ask my questions. But basically, I have an ex that broke up with me because of a story I've written. On hindsight, our relationship was already in shambles, and I think that was probably the perfect catalyst. It was basically something she told me from her childhood that I found really sweet and moving. And at a creative writing workshop on memory, I was immediately drawn to that story, and I said, okay, I'll write this, but with like embellished and altered details. And I was just wondering on that note, if any of you have faced like personal fallout from the stories you've written, or in the process of writing, has there been any point where you went, oh, I shouldn't write this, this is not my story to tell?
Yeah, I also, I had a breakup because an ex like read my notebooks and I'd like written down like the name of his ex-girlfriend with a question mark. But she came into my life, she was like stalking me a bit. So of course but he was worried that was an editorial plan to like just write about her entire life. And it was like quite violating because it wasn't even a story yet. It was just like a notebook is kind of a place where you can write anything and you have speculations and none of it, half of it won't even become solid. But even if it did become solid, it's like, I think as a writer you need there's that classic quote about having like a little bit of ice in your heart, and also going back to my garbage truck where you will take from the world. And if something's a good story, like it is hard to resist. And I think that's like an ongoing ethical question for writers. But I think the Capote versus the Swans book and TV show was brilliant on that, because he wrote about his like gang of Upper East Side women he would like hang out and gossip with, but he couldn't resist writing about them, and they had this massive fallout, which basically ruined his life. He became an alcoholic and died not that long after. And the saddest part is Answered Prayers, which was a result of this, wasn't his best work. It didn't do justice to the fallout that happened in his life, and he could have written more stuff and had a richer life if he didn't write that. So I think it is very complicating. Even if your intuition is like, I want to write this, I need to write this, in his case, it wasn't the best idea. And so that has like, yeah, and as I said earlier, I'm trying to like watch myself more, like still be a kind of like vengeful garbage truck, but definitely watch myself.
That's interesting. My ex is an artist, and we had, because I think about the ethics of this all the time, as a fellow garbage truck. And we ended up having kind of, we never had to, it was unspoken, but that we were allowed to use each other in each other's work, you know, so I appear in some of her photography, or more abstractly in her sculpture, and then she will appear in my novel, and not just as a person, but also I will sometimes use her, or did, you know, this is obviously where X is now, but would use a childhood anecdote that didn't belong to me, that belonged to her, because when that's obvious, I would show it to her and let her read everything. So the idea was just to have this open exchange, and I think at the core of that is this idea of being vulnerable at the same time in the same place. So as long as you're both vulnerable in that exchange, I think then you can create an ethics from it. I mean, obviously this is a very specific situation, and I haven't encountered this yet with my family. It's kind of happened briefly in some of my poetry, but in poetry there's more of a wall to hide behind, because obviously the text is operating differently to how it would in prose. But I'm looking forward to those conversations in the future. And I think, you know, you have to confront that as a writer, and think you have to know ethically where you stand. And then you have to kind of develop that ethics in collaboration with someone else. I think it can't always be a solo act, I think is how I see it.
You've got the mic. Eliza next.
I was looking pleadingly because I need to go to the bathroom.
Sarah? Anyone else? No, it doesn't affect me. I'm not interested in non-fictional stuff. Yeah. I'm one of those people where friends tell me things and then they're like, oh, are you going to put this in one of you? And I'm like, no, it's okay. It's not that I find it interesting, but not in a, I want to make something up based on this.
I've also seen how some of what my wife writes is non-fiction, and she for a long time had someone say, that didn't happen. She's like, no, it did happen. And it became a kind of stalking situation, because he went through all of her Instagram photos, looked to say, like, you were never there. This is taken from a different site. He contacted everyone who she followed on Instagram, went through kind of social media, all the rest of it. And that was about something that did happen and was still this bone of contention. So I kind of feel that if the chances are that if someone will have a resonance with what's in your work, either see that as something to be kind of moved by, or something to feel affronted by, and like it wasn't your story to tell in that sense, whether it's real or not. I guess I'd kind of want to make space for when it's not consciously that you've co-opted someone's story, and that it isn't a case of saying, should I do this or shouldn't I, but that you realise that you've, without having a clear creative purpose, actually assumed someone else's story as part of this narrative and not realised it. That's something I think I'm more worried about than having to stop myself from taking on stories from more interesting people than me.
Is that the end? I guess it's the end.
Yeah, this
apocalyptic fiction.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Most probably. Thank you very much for...
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your insights into your inspiration, your beginnings, and your personal stories as well. And thank you, Helen, for moderating these sessions wonderfully. Come back tomorrow. This is for our online views at 11:30 Central European Time for the next panel discussion, Telescope. And we're going to have lunch now. So we have about 50 minutes, I believe. So, yeah, wishing you a good lunch, good conversations, and see you back at 2. Thank you.